This is The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week my guest is author and professor Jeff Benz, and we talk about his new book, The Mighty Oak. My guest this week is the author of the new book, The Mighty Oak, a professor at Manhattanville College. Jeff Benz, welcome, I guess, kind of welcome back to The Other 51.
Thanks, Brian.
This is the second attempt we've had at recording this podcast. We tried to record one earlier today. And Jeff, I think you can agree with me. That was the best podcast ever recorded in the history of podcasts, right?
Yeah, I think that's very true. Yeah, clearly lost forever to the ethers.
Yes. So what happens when you get two liberal arts professors trying to use technology is one end doesn't record. So Jeff, very happy to have you here. And the story of how you're here is kind of our mutual acquaintance, Jeff Perlman. A couple of weeks ago, Jeff was on this podcast, and I ask everybody who I have on the podcast what the best thing they've read lately is. And Jeff talked about The Mighty Oak, your book, and just raved about it, said incredibly great things about it. And I went right out, got a copy at the local library, and read it in a few days. And I agree, it's a spectacular work. You should be very proud of it. So congratulations on having this out.
Right. Thanks, Brian.
I guess first of all, what's it like? What's it like to have this book out? I know you worked on it for a long time, 10 years or so, and to have it come out kind of have a book coming out in 2020, given COVID, given protests, given the election, given kind of everything that's going on in the world, what's it like to kind of have this for you to have this book come out now?
Yeah, I mean, we did speak earlier, and to kind of return to a point there, not sure that for a book, and for this book, that it's going to make, that it matters that much. It seems to me a book is a personal thing, and it's meant to be read. It's meant to be read sort of, one person at a time, generally speaking, unless it's audiobook. If this were theater, of course, they've just been so nailed, and people in the film business, it's been so hard. But for a book such as this, I don't know. I hope that it still gets in people's hands, and I hope it brings them some ability to put attention here on something else, to put attention on a book and on a novel that hopefully people will find moving. So I'm not sure it's affected the book's release a whole lot. It certainly affected all of us in our lives, of course.
Sure. And I know that we had spoke earlier, you've kind of been fortunate professionally that you haven't had to teach during COVID-19 and during all of this, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So we talked a little bit about online teaching and teaching writing online. And since that first conversation, that was stellar, but no one will ever hear. I am.
We're going to make up for it, man. We're just getting rolling.
I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the challenges of teaching writing. I want to get to the book in a bit, but the challenges of teaching writing anyway. Like, it's a very tricky and interesting thing to try to teach, whether you're teaching creative writing like you do or journalism like I do. Even in the best of times, but now to kind of add this remote element or the hybrid element, the online element of it, it's been super challenging. And I wonder, as you kind of see what your colleagues are doing, see what other people in your space are doing, and start thinking about getting back to the classroom, how are you thinking of what do you see as the biggest challenges, and how do you think you're going to try to negotiate that?
Well, it seems to me that, and I suspect you're the same way. In the classroom, I try to get the students to kind of work from their gut and from their heart more than from their brain. And so having a small group there, once we learn to trust each other in person, that allows the student writers to take some chances and to try to write more authentically to who they are and to the situation that they want to write about, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be a challenge online, because it's hard to get a sense of the room. Obviously online I'm sort of putting out one kind of vibe, if you will. They're putting out another, and we can sort of see when we're face to face if we're sort of connecting in the way that we'd like to connect. I think that's going to be tougher online. That said, writing students tend to want to be there, of course, and tend to be pretty supportive of each other, which is great. So I don't like to make the classroom too much, most teachers I don't think do, too much about me standing there and sort of talking at them. So I think that online we'll still be able to do some small group work. They can work with each other. We'll just have to do our best to try to make it hands-on, even though, of course, it's virtual.
Sure. You use the phrase teaching students about and getting them to work from their gut and their heart. And I know you did an interview with Jeff Pearlman about this book a couple weeks ago on his podcast. And you talked about that writing this book, The Mighty Oak, right? About writing from your gut and writing from your heart and not from your brain. First of all, what do you mean by that? What do you mean writing from your gut and working from your gut?
Well, it seems to me like we can have a high concept idea. We can have an idea that, sort of like a brainy idea that sounds good. We could come up with 15 of them right now, and they sound good. But if they're not authentic to the writer, it's not really what, in my case, what I want to write about. It's going to be hard for me to sustain. I get nothing to go back to except my head and my thinking about this topic. But the thinking about the topic, I don't think. I mean, obviously it's important, but it's not going to give that kind of lived experience. So, in The Mighty Oak, it was very important to me that the readers have a chance at, anyways, if I've done my work, but that the readers have um, a way to kind of feel what Oak is feeling. So if I'm writing from my gut and I'm sort of writing the book from the inside out. If I'm feeling what Oak is feeling, in this case, then if I can convey that on the page, usually through Oak's actions or through a character's actions, then it's my hope that it can connect to a similar place with the reader, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And so I'm wondering, as you work with students about that, how do you teach students how to write from their gut and write from their heart? Like, what are some of the ways that you kind of get them to understand what you're doing and get them to do that?
I love a good, you know, conspiracy thriller as much as the next person when it comes to a movie, but I couldn't write one. That's not authentic to me. That would be trying to brain it out, and there are people who are far brainier than I when it comes to, that genre, if you will. So part of it is looking at and trying, looking at for myself and trying to model for them and trying to get them to get the sense that, yeah, we like a lot of things that may not be, sort of in our emotional, authentic wheelhouse. And, just to spend a second on that, because it's of importance to me, I think. Doesn't mean that I ever played in the ECHL.
Right.
You know what I mean? Doesn't mean that I skated at Division I hockey in college. But I think it's a matter of being drawn to something, being drawn to a job, to being drawn to a place. Um, who knows why we're drawn to them, but we are, at least I am. And from there, we can kind of move ahead, hopefully with some sort of authenticity to the job and to the place, because it kind of called to us. We were connected to it. Part of the reason it took 10 years to write this book is that can be a slow process. And it's idiosyncratic. Is that the right word? I mean, it's individual to the person. So I'm always of the feeling that if something is interesting to you, uh, you can make it with some skill, you can make it interesting and connect with a reader. Whereas if it's just an assignment, even if the assignment sounds sort of from a brainy point of view to be a very exciting assignment, if it's not exciting to you, I think it's gonna be very, very hard to make it exciting, particularly over the course of something long form like a novel.
No, I agree with that, and I say the same thing to my journalism students all the time.
Mhm.
When you're reporting, when you're doing a feature story or a news story, and something happens at a game, at a meeting, somebody says something, and you go, "Oh, cool!" I need a better name than the "Oh, cool" test, but that's what I say it as. It's that needs to be in your story. Oftentimes I say that should be the lead, that should be your first paragraph, because if it's interesting to you and it makes you say that, there's a really good chance it's going to make me say that as the reader. And I'm going to be drawn into that the same way you are. And instead of kind of thinking of your assignment or your story as, what's, I'm using air quotes here, proper journalism or what's newsy about it, tell me what you found interesting about it. Because there's a good chance that you're going to connect with the reader and the story is going to land the message that you're trying to land, whether it's conveying news, conveying emotion or something like that, through that connection of something that you find interesting rather than kind of, like you said, the brainy thing of what you think you should be saying or should be writing about.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's maybe it's the difference sometimes between, trying to be charming, which if it's even successful, only goes so far and so deep, as opposed to trying to authentically connect.
Right. So what drew you to the story, and what drew you to the creating this character of Oak, who is a hockey player who is kind of on the tail end of his career. When we talked earlier, it was interesting because he doesn't think of himself as the enforcer type, but that is the role he has kind of taken on, and the book kind of unfolds from there. What drew you to that? What drew your gut to that, and kind of knew that this was a story you were going to unfold and tell?
Yeah, well, I like hockey, and now this is just generalizing from my life, so it's not a blanket statement. But anyways, the hockey players that I've met over the decades tend to be pretty big-hearted guys and spirited guys. They got a lot of life to them, a spark to them, and I think the game does too. So that was interesting to me to try to capture that. And then, of course, it's also a sport where, while things are changing, particularly at the NHL, but nevertheless, we know that it's a sport where fighting has always had a place, and now with this notion of concussions, et cetera, we've got still more issues that are coming, are out there to be discussed and hopefully worked through. But mostly it was this notion of someone with spirit and heart. And then for characters, I'm interested in characters who are wounded. By that, I generally mean, I guess, emotionally wounded. And certainly Oak's 32 years have left him with some damage, some of which he acknowledges, and quite a bit, which, as you say, he acknowledges but explains in a way that increasingly, or maybe right from the start, the reader knows is not actually accurate, if that makes
Right.
sense. So I like work, I like jobs, I like this guy's job, I like the notion of a minor leaguer, I like the notion of someone who's still fighting, but maybe Oak was a big guy and liked hockey and was really good at hockey right from the start. And in some ways, what interests me too is this notion of, maybe his world was narrowed for him early on.
Right. No, and I love this idea of work, and kind of expand on that a little bit. But as you were talking, I was just kind of thinking through the book. And if you've read this, I hope this question, not you've read it, but if the listener is it will understand this.
Not for a while.
Do you does Oak like hockey? Does he like playing hockey?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. He likes playing hockey. The kid in him likes playing hockey. Has it become something else? Yeah, sure, maybe it has. Um, and that's something that he has to look at. He never gets even to the I guess he gets he gets briefly to the AHL when he's young. He's not strong enough he's not good enough to play there. He's not a good enough skater to play there, and he kicks around for a decade in the smaller leagues like the ECHL and things like that, which still have great players. And of course there's a lot of movement there, so it gives him hope. But that hope, I think, is increasingly, misguided as his 20s go on.
Right.
What do we pick him up at 32, I think? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what is it about work and jobs that you as an author like and are drawn to?
Well, for one thing, it gives a visual sense. You know what I mean? So if I can get someone in a job and I can get them doing something, and if the job is interesting to me, again, doesn't mean it would be necessarily interesting to someone else, but I think that if it's interesting to me, I can hopefully get it to be interesting for someone else. It gives a visual sense, so it allows, I think, through actions and through visuals, for the reader to kind of feel what the character is feeling, rather than some kind of narrator or some kind of author, or what an authorial voice sort of telling them what the character is feeling. So I think that work and place give us a visual sense for the characters to push off of,
Right.
and in that pushing, we can learn about them.
Right. And you mentioned place, and certainly this book is very rooted in Southie, in Boston. And it is almost Southie. I've reading this felt like Southie was its own character in the book. And you mentioned that in your interview with Jeff about the importance of place in your fiction. I'm just wondering if you could expand on that, why place is so important along with work.
Well, I'm fascinated by place. I mean, I'm fascinated by all places actually. But then some I feel connected enough to hopefully try to explore in writing or explore well in writing. I live in New York City. You can say New York City, that means nothing. You know, there are so many New York cities. There are New York cities within. So there's cultures and there's subcultures and there's subcultures, you know, and what are you raised in and how does it shape you? Your immediate family, your larger group of friends, your schooling, the culture that you're brought into, you know what I mean? So yeah, so I'm quite interested in how these things shape a person, and then how, you know, maybe you're in accordance with it, maybe it works great for you, but oftentimes there's this rub, and again, in that rub can lead to some sort of action that comes out of like a direct understanding of the rub, or maybe it indirectly causes some kind of you know, misthinking or sense of self in a character, and the character is working from that. Perhaps that's what I mean by a wound, you know. um, so I don't claim, I mean, this is fiction, so I don't claim expertise in hockey. I don't claim expertise in Boston or the neighborhoods of Boston or in CTE, which possibly Oak is suffering from. I mean, it's a fictional character in a fictional world, but I hope that in the experience of reading the book, it reads authentic. You know, these slivers of these things feel authentic to the reader and to those who know these worlds perhaps more largely than I do.
Yeah, no, you know, I know Southie from the movies. So, you know, I know Southie from Good Will Hunting and from The Departed. But it definitely had an authentic feel to it that didn't feel forced. And again, I don't know Southie, so I know it through fictional work. But I'm fascinated by place too, and you know, usually in terms of journalism. But it's just always fascinating. It's interesting to me when you think of one of the questions I'll ask a lot of reporters is what makes a good blank story. So what makes a good Philadelphia story? What makes a good Buffalo story or Boston story? And I don't know if it's, you know, kind of older cities that have more of a feel to it, or if that's just a cliche on it. But it does feel like place can be and is so formative to people and can be informative, especially for a fiction writer, I would assume, to kind of help establish a world and help establish a character and their relationships to people inside it and outside it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But you know, we got to work really hard. I have to work really hard to be alive to it. There's a line in The Mighty Oak, you know, about South Boston. It's like you mentioned the movies. It's like in the movies, no one in Southie goes to college. You know, well, it's not true. The real estate alone is you know, I don't know, $750,000 for a house, for many houses now, and up from there. So this notion of I just want to make sure that in any of my writing that it feels as close to an accurate truth, you know, an accurate truth. There are many truths, but an accurate truth as possible. Yeah, yeah. And I think there's a lot of strength. No, I'm not saying for my book, but I think in general, in the books I'm drawn to, there's a lot of strength that comes from that felt sense of a place that the author clearly has and can convey.
Right. What are some of the what are some of those great examples of place in books that you've been drawn to, or books that you can remember that you kind of draw from? Maybe not direct inspiration, but kind of like as an example of books and stories that do place in a way that you're drawn to.
Man, there's so many of them that it's going to be difficult for me to just leap one out. I can think of a book by James Kelman called How Late It Was, How Late, in which the language definitely rises out of the place. You know, it's not so much that the place is, you know, is a defined street or something like that, but the language of the world of that pretty bruised character comes out of it. You and I were talking earlier. You had asked me what's a good book I'd read lately, and to bring it back up, I just finished reading Walter Tevis's book, The Hustler, and then The Color of Money, and they do place very well too. I think, you know, the place in this sense being the pool room, but the sorts of people who are drawn, and very different sorts of people who are drawn to that, and drawn to small time and then large time betting on pool. So, you know, that comes to mind. Yeah.
So what are some of the ways, whether it's research or not, that you try to capture a place in your writing? Obviously, I'd love to hear about your research process and what you do for that. But in terms of kind of capturing what like Southie really is like, and not that caricature that we kind of know of from the movies or any other kind of setting or place that you're writing, how do you capture a place either through language or through research or through both?
Well, it's got a call to me. So again, this is a book about a guy that was raised in South Boston and goes back to it, and also spends a lot of time at Quincy, and has spent time around across the American South and in Texas. So again, it's a narrow slice there that he's coming from, and yet of course he's going to be steeped in that narrow slice. So first thing is it's sort of got to be called to me. It goes back to jobs. So you think something like that takes place on a nuclear submarine, I always say would probably be a pretty exciting story. And it might well be, but I couldn't write it. I'm just not drawn to do the depth of research that would make that a compelling piece of work. Perhaps on some kind of surface way I could get there, but not a real piece of work about what that life would mean. But I don't know. I'm interested in rodeo. I'm interested in women's rodeo. Like, that whole scene is kind of interesting to me. I can't even ride a horse, but so who knows? But so who knows why we're called to it? But once we're called to it, I'm not writing on that topic. It just came to mind. But I guess once I'm called to something, then the research sort of suggests itself. I wonder if you've had this experience, in your sports writing days. I kind of feel like if I'm authentically onto something, a place, a job in a place, usually a character that is working those things, the research sort of suggests itself well, and my ignorant questions to people are received well.
Yes, absolutely. And what I've found, I've talked about this on the show with other writers before, is if when you're interviewing somebody or talking to somebody, and you may have the ignorant question, and my trick or my advice that I always give to my students is, own it, admit this is probably a dumb question, but don't try to fake knowing something. Always kind of, there's no problem
Yeah.
admitting that you don't know. But if they can sense that it comes from a place of genuine curiosity, and not like you're trying to nail them on something or get them on something, but that you're really interested in what they do and where they're from, what the place is like, it leads your research and reporting in better ways. And that, I think if you're interested in something, you're kind of going to be, I think that natural curiosity comes through even more than if you're a good reporter, but not so into an assignment like that it's that little extra spark, and it's kind of ineffable, I think, but it does kind of add a little bit extra to your research. And I think it kind of maybe propels you in your writing and your reporting and your research a little bit.
I think so. I'm not sure if it's ineffable though. I mean, I feel like it's got to be a really informed ignorance. It's got to be a high level ignorance. I'm not going to go up to some guys playing minor league hockey and say like, what's it like, skating on this team? That's because I'm not going to get an answer that does either of us any good. It's also going to show that I don't really have an interest. So I've got to really know who I'm talking to and what, I got to get to the point of my sort of experienced ignorance, if that makes
Right.
sense.
You've been teaching writing for a while now. I'm wondering what has teaching creative writing for so long, what has that taught you about writing that you've brought to this book or brings to your short stories? Like, what have you learned about writing by teaching it?
Well, I'll tell you something that it might sound strange, kind of out of context, since we don't know each other and this is just a podcast, but not just a podcast, but I mean, in other words, we're not having a long-term conversation over months or what have you as friends, or as fellow writers. But with this novel, everything that I'm teaching from, um, I think, is the place that I'm writing this novel from. So we talked about kind of writing from the gut and from the heart, not so much from the brain, and going back to that initial impulse, in the gut and the heart and the place and the job and the wound, and keep and letting. I always teach like letting the language I've learned to articulate it as letting the language of the book not come from the author, but come from the emotional world of the protagonist. So I've been teaching that, man, and I've been teaching about connecting and feeling connection, and I've been teaching about visual and active, um, but particularly on the language, that that the character and the world of the character brings the language. The author doesn't bring the language, which is a bit of a trick, I realize, but that's the way I articulate it. And so in writing this book, I thought, man, if nobody publishes this book, maybe everything that I've been teaching from is not, in fact, a way to connect with other readers. And it was going to be, and I told my class this too. I was like, my classes, if some people listen, man, I mean, this thing, you know how it is, it's hard to sell fiction, etc. But and so this is in part why I really appreciate your generous words about it, because it makes me feel good, because I was like, oh good, I connected with this guy Brian who I don't even know, and that was my instinct, that it could connect with people like Brian or Jeff or folks like that. So it's sort of a long-winded answer. Does that kind of get at what you were asking?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm wondering, I love the idea of the language coming from the protagonist. And again,
Well, from his world.
from his world. So how do you, like, can you unpack that a little bit? Again, someone who's written really bad fiction that has never left my laptop and probably never will. What does that mean? What is that idea? How's that manifest itself?
I'm just trying to think of this book, but I might give you a different example. Yeah, there's a wonderful book. I find it easier to talk about other people's book. There's a wonderful book by Evan Connell, came out in the 50s, called Mrs. Bridge. Speaking of The Hustler, it was another Paul Newman, in this case, Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward movie. Then there was Mr. Bridge after that with Paul Newman. Anyhow, Mrs. Bridge is, and again, this is showing the use of setting to me and the use of job in such a perfect way, because if you told me that this was a novel about a 1937 upper class kind of waspish, to use that term, quote unquote housewife, to use the term of the day, in Kansas City, it's not necessarily the kind of, the first book that I would reach for. But Connell was so alive to it that he wrote this unbelievable book about Mrs. Bridge. And curiously, it's like 270 pages and it's like 110 chapters, something like that. Yeah, and each thing is like a little snapshot of this life, and it builds in a really remarkable way. Mm-hmm. But what I'm getting at, that, I guess can say this on a podcast, you're never going to see the word fuck in that book, because that is a word that just would never, for Mrs. Bridge, who worries about that somebody in her guest bathroom used the little hand doily things, you would hang over your actual washcloth.
Right.
She was horrified that maybe, I can't remember, maybe she had hung them wrong, or who were these coarse people. You're never going to see that F-bomb in that book, because in her emotional world, you're never going to hear it used in any way, that F word, because in her emotional world, that's not language that's there for her.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I'm wondering, as you're working on this book, like, do you start with kind of a character sketch of Oak and then kind of go from there? You don't? Okay.
Yeah, I totally feel it. So I'm writing it. I guess this is something else to go back to maybe teaching, but certainly my experience, I'm writing it from the kind of inside out. I've forgotten, somebody asked me a question and my response was like, you have to go back and edit the book, obviously, once it sells. And I had forgotten, if Oak had a beard or not in the draft at the point of the book in the draft that we had sold. But boy, I could tell you what the experience of feeling his face was like.
Okay.
So I think that's what can be helpful as a check to make sure we're not BSing ourselves as writers, which is, you got to come back again, like, what's the felt experience of this guy? What's the felt experience of this guy in the world that he's in right now, in the scene that he's in right now? And he brings, we all bring our entire life with us, don't we?
So what, you kind of hinted at it, so I'll give you a chance to talk up the books a little bit. My best thing that I've read lately is The Mighty Oak by Jeff Benz, which is not blowing smoke. It actually is. But what are the best things that you've read lately?
Well, I think I would come to that book because I just read them. And I'll tell you something, maybe it's an interesting story because as it is now clear to your listeners, we had a chat earlier that didn't function. So, and I had mentioned Tevis's books, The Hustler and Color of Money. And I went back and just looked at them, which was nice, to kind of revisit them after we spoke and before this talk. And I'll tell you a quick observation I had, which I had kind of blocked out because it annoyed me so much. And maybe this gets at what we're talking about. I will ruin the ending of the movie The Hustler, but because I think it's a bad choice, I don't feel badly doing so. In the book, there is a love affair between the main character and another character, and in the end of the book, the main character realizes, I won't give too much away, except to say that the main character realizes something about himself, and she realizes something about himself. They could sort of come to that moment. And it's clear that at least at the end of the story that the book covers, that they can't be together. In the movie, she kills herself. They rewrite it so that she kills herself.
I forgot about that. I haven't seen The Hustler in years, so I forgot about that. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a really bad and inauthentic choice. It totally changes her character. It totally changes the vibe of the book. It's inauthentic to the vibe of the book, and it's inauthentic to that world too. It's totally, what do you call it, like hoary melodrama that she would kill herself in the context of that story. So I think that even though it's celebrated as this great movie, in rewatching it just a couple months ago, I was like, I couldn't believe that that choice was made for that character. It almost invalidates what Tevis was trying to do with their relationship. It does invalidate what Tevis was trying to do with their relationship. Yeah. So it's an inauthentic choice to the world that Tevis had. How's that?
That's good. All right, so I will put links to those books in show notes. I'll put a link to The Mighty Oak in show notes as well. And Jeff, I think we equaled the greatest podcast that was ever recorded. I think with this one, I think we pulled it off.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for your enthusiasm about the book. It means a lot.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Show notes for this and all of our episodes can be found at sportsmediaguide.com by clicking on the Other 51 tab. If you like the show, please consider giving it a rating and a review, either at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help people find the show. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.